Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's the last week of classes here at Stanford, the end of our first fully in-person quarter of instruction this academic year, and I appreciate you taking the time to come out today in this very beautiful weather on the first day of June. I'm Mark Duggan, the director of CEPR, Stanford's Institute for Economic Policy Research, and I want to welcome you to CEPR today to discuss a timely and important topic as we approach a statewide primary election 1 week from today, the future of governance in California. For the past year, I've been part of a team leading the California 100 initiative, which is focused on inspiring a long-term vision and strategy for California's next century that is innovative, sustainable, and equitable. As part of that work, my colleagues and I at CEPR have been learning quite a lot about California. We've been especially focusing on the aspects of California that are less golden than we might like, and how we can work now to improve California's future. Two of those aspects are the focus of the latter two panels this afternoon: fiscal reform in California and the state's role as a foreign policy player. I'm joined in this work by an extremely dedicated and thoughtful California 100 team here at Stanford, at UC Berkeley, and all across the state, including the executive director of California 100, Karthick Ramakrishnan. I'm sorry if I didn't quite. Did I?
Mark and I know each other well, except on a last name.
Yeah, except on a last name. He's just Karthick to me, so I'm sorry to have just mangled that pronunciation. But in any case, my good friend Karthick is a professor of public policy at UC Riverside, where he founded their Center for Social Innovation, and he will be providing some introductory remarks to kick off our first panel, introducing 3 new California 100 research reports on fiscal reform, governance, federalism, and foreign policy. So Karthick, take it away.
Thank you so much, Mark. And before we get started with the program, I just want to say what a pleasure it's been over the last year and a half, Mark, that we've gotten to know each other. And one of the jokes I make, and it's only half funny perhaps, but there's a grain of truth to it, is we're already improving California for the better by bringing Cal and Stanford together. Having a project like this with these two remarkable institutions and the important role they play in improving the state that we all care about so deeply. Before we get started, we're just going to have a brief intro video about California 100, and then I'll say a bit more about our initiative, and we'll hear from 3 of our research teams.
California is different. That's our superpower. We're the state where big ideas take off, with discoveries and technology, from music to movies to movements. What if we all came together to envision our long-term future, where everyone is given the opportunity to succeed, where all of our neighborhoods are healthy and strong? We are California 100. We engage communities from every corner of the state to design a better future. We are students and parents, researchers and organizers, entrepreneurs and policymakers. And we are harnessing the state's immense talent with dozens of research and innovation projects to ensure California's leadership well into the next century. We can do this. After all, we are the Golden State, a place of dreamers and doers. So come join us. Let's think big and different. Let's create the next 100 years, starting today.
So that is California 100. It's a pretty ambitious initiative. We're only a little over a year old. We launched publicly in July of 2021, so I guess actually a little less than a year old in terms of our public face. And it's just been incredible work. You'll be hearing from 3 of our research teams. We have 20 research centers throughout California that have been engaged in this work, including in the UC system, Stanford, USC, and a bunch of other places, including Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and Loyola Marymount. Those are our 2 newest research teams. And we'll be getting reports on food systems from Cal Poly in the fall, and on the future of business in California from the team at Loyola Marymount. California 100 is, as the title suggests, a lot of people ask me, what does 100 stand for? Are we bringing 100 notables from across California to sit and muse, stroke their chins, and contemplate California's future? No, that's not what the 100 is. The 100 signifies 100 years. And I'll say, as a policy researcher who is evidence-driven, when the opportunity to think and research and imagine long-term futures, it hurt my head a little bit. And Henry Brady, our director of research, Henry, I think even you, and so many others, we're not used to be thinking 100 years down the road. It's challenging stuff. We are not in the prediction business. We are not in the forecasting business. That's not what this is about. Fundamentally, it's about thinking about plausible scenarios for our future that might have some echoes from the past, or we might see examples in other states or other countries, and we can draw from that, but also engage more deeply in more risk and risky types of analyses. Arguably, we've been through two of some of the biggest scenarios that most people might not have foreseen. Once in a century pandemic and Europe at war. A year ago, well, maybe a bunch of people at Stanford would have foreseen this a year ago, but many of us did not foresee that and the kinds of implications it would have from our global system all the way down to what's going on at the ports of LA and Long Beach, for example. But that's the kind of situation we're living through today. Hopefully in the work that we do, we're seeing this from our research side, but there are many other streams of work in California 100. Proud to have Allison Burke as our Director of Advanced Technology, and here at CEPR as an important partner in this work to think about advanced technology not only as an area of focus, but as a through line, thinking about technology, thinking about data science, and the ways that we can improve public policy and decision-making more generally in California with the kind of technological riches that California has to offer. We also have Amy Lerman, our Director of Innovation, who's working on a range of policy innovation demonstration projects, most of them involving public agencies and some involving nonprofits and other actors as well, to think about ways that we can innovate in ways that can scale up, either in terms of moving across local jurisdictions or scaling up in terms of starting in one state government agency and then moving to other state government agencies. Finally, we have Jesse Melgar, our Director of Engagement. And he comes to us from the Governor's Office and is lead on making sure that the kinds of reports that we're generating isn't just something of intellectual curiosity, that it actually has an audience, not only in Sacramento, but in many other parts of the state, including in Silicon Valley, in Southern California, Central California, and Northern California as well. There's a lot that we're going to learn today, and in many ways, so we have two more reports, but today is the final set of the original 13 that we had. You can check out our website to see all of the prior reports, including the ones that we're releasing today. But in many ways, I would say today is special, not only because it's our last major event involving the research stream, but in some ways you can think of it as a kind of methodology about how California tackles all of these various substantive policy issues. We have to be able to pay for it. So fiscal policy and fiscal reform is on offer today. We have to think about governance in the state, including the role of media and civil society as partners in the kind of governance that needs to happen, that it's not just about government agencies. And finally, we need to think about California in a federalism context and potentially playing a stronger role in terms of its foreign policy making capabilities. So we're in for a treat today. First, we'll start with fiscal policy and fiscal reform, and Patrick Murphy from the Opportunity Institute.
Thank you and good afternoon. And first I'd like to thank the Cal 100 team, not only for putting together this event with CEPR, but also for all the work over the last year on what I think is a really important effort. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues and co-authors from the Opportunity Institute, Carrie Hanal, Maria Echaveste, and Alvina Zhao. I'm the one that happens to be here today, but it was very much a group effort and want to make sure they get credit where credit is due. So California fiscal policy, why is it important and why does it matter? And I have something of a bias, but all you have to do is take a step back and say, just about everything government does takes resources. And so if we're going to have conversations about big issues like climate change or affordable housing, at some point, as Karthick says, you're going to have to figure out a way to pay for it. And so that's where the budget nerds come in. So that's why we're here. For us to try to look forward at California's fiscal policy, we've done what the other California 100 research teams do, is to start by looking at the past and try to identify the main drivers. And we've identified 3 main drivers in our work in terms of its impact on the fiscal future. And the drivers are the economy, demographics, and policy choices. And the first 2, the economy and population, demographics, kind of go hand in hand. If you look back over time, California's economy has shown a remarkable ability to both grow quickly relative to the rest of the country, but innovate and adapt over that time. So you could start with agriculture and natural resources and then move into manufacturing and now into this information technology world that we see and celebrate. And I think it'd be safe to say that the California economy was pivoting before pivoting was a thing. With that, the California's population has been growing. And those 2 have worked together. A lot of that population growth has been fueled by migration, people coming from other states or outside of the country. And those migrants brought both labor, but also innovation. And if you take those 2 things together, a growing economy and a growing population, that's really good news for government finances. Why? Because more economic activity, more people engaging in economic activity, that's more tax revenue being generated. And that tax revenue can in turn be taken and reinvested back in the state. So that's how you're able to fund things like infrastructure, highway systems, et cetera. Or human capital, build a world-class public higher education system. Our third driver are the policy choices that have been made in the past. And there it's a little bit more of a mixed bag or a contradiction. So if I go back, say, 40 years, we can see where conservative activists used the ballot box very intentionally to try to constrain fiscal choices. So there we put in caps on spending or through Prop 13 on how it is that you can raise taxes and what you can do with those taxes. Since that time, if we go more recently and we look at what decision makers have done, mostly driven by elected officials, we've seen very much a lean in terms of progressive taxation, particularly in terms of the income tax. And at the same time, expanding into a relatively robust social safety net. If you take those 3 drivers and take where we stand today and ask, how is this fiscal system working? However, at best I can kind of say, okay. I would say that the system we have, the structure we have, works some of the time for some Californians. And if you look at it over the long run and you look at the inequality in the state, we would say that sort of, a lot of Californians aren't enjoying that. And when the economy is growing, the fiscal situation is good, but if the economy goes into recession, we can hit a crisis. So that's what I mean by sort of some of the time and for some Californians. So if I take that and project into the future and try to figure out sort of what are possible scenarios, the 2 sources of uncertainty, you won't be surprised, are whether or not the economy is able to continue to innovate and grow, and whether or not Californians are willing to really embrace some bold policy choices to address some structural problems that we have. Our most promising scenario we call the golden state of affairs. You'll hear a lot of golden state, I think, over the next discussion. For us, this is a situation where the economy continues to grow, continues to innovate, and at the same time, we address some of these structural problems. And you could imagine that with that, California would continue to lead the nation and perhaps continue to lead the world in a lot of cases and be sort of the envy of it in terms of its dynamism, and at the same time, take those resources generated by more investment, more economic growth, more people coming in the state, and bring them in so that at the folks in the modest level of income are able to also stay in the state and live. In other words, this sort of vision is this one where all Californians can stay here and live and thrive. If you go to the other end of our spectrum of scenarios, we have something that we call once a leader, now a follower. where from a policy perspective, we really don't engage any of these challenges. And at the same time, from the economic perspective, we're kind of one deep recession away where we fall into a slump. The economic slump becomes elongated. We haven't made the changes in the structures to address it. And in turn, all of a sudden, people don't want to come to California. People don't want to invest in California. And as a result, the state has less revenue and less resources. So we can't provide that safety net like we have in the past. And you can, I don't think, go too far to see this downward spiral that will happen. And that spiral could last a number of years, or it could last decades. And there's evidence in other countries where that has happened. So how do we avoid that pessimistic scenario and get ourselves on an optimistic path? We have a number of recommendations. I encourage you to go to the website and check it out, but I'm going to touch on three real briefly. The first is to modernize the state's tax system, revenue system, and the sales and use tax would be a great place to start. Its current structure is about 90 years old, what we tax. If you were to broaden that tax base to include services, you would probably make it more stable. You'd certainly make it more progressive. We also promote or suggest that the state establish a social welfare fund, essentially an endowment for the state. Other states have these as a way in which we kind of smooth out the highs and smooth out the lows and provide a source of reinvestment in the state, either for business innovation, human capital, higher education, et cetera. And our last one is that if we've put policymakers in something of constraints, or as we call it, a fiscal straitjacket, we need to let the elected officials do their jobs, and we have to start addressing some of these constraints. And the elephant in the room in California is Proposition 13. And until we start talking about addressing how it constrains policy choices, it distorts markets, and actually undermines democracy, we aren't going to address some of these big structural issues. So we think that conversation has to start around reforming Prop 13. So as you can tell, we're just talking about the small things here in terms of reform. But that's as good a place to start and to stop for this point, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Frank Fukuyama, who's a co-author of the report on governance, media, and civil society, and he's based here at Stanford at the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law.
So thanks, Karthick, very much for the opportunity to participate in it. I had to walk all the way across Galvez in order to get here, so it was quite a sacrifice on my part. So our report was done by three people, my colleague at CDDRL, Mike Bennon, and this is part of the Berkeley-Stanford collaboration, I guess. Henry Brady contributed a very important part of it, and I'm told I've got 5 minutes to summarize it, so we'll see whether that's possible. Governance is basically the ability of state institutions to provide basic public goods, services, security, infrastructure, a whole variety of things in hopefully a representative and effective way. But those two descriptors are sometimes in tension because you want decisions to be made that are as broadly inclusive of the whole population as possible, democratically accountable, but they also need to be made. The decisions need to be made and implemented in an efficient and effective way. And sometimes by moving to one extreme or the other, either of excessive efficiency, think China, or excessive representativeness, and as we'll see, think California, those trade-offs get a little bit complicated. It's also the case that the degree to which you want one or the other depends on at what stage of governance you're at. So you probably want the greatest representativeness when you're simply agenda setting and exploring the problem. You need to narrow it when you deliberate, because if 40 million people deliberate on an issue, you'll never get to the end of the deliberation. And finally, the decision has to be made by a smaller and more effective body. California has particular problems in governance because it has either supplemented or in some cases substituted direct democracy mechanisms for representative institutions. There are basically 4 of them in play: recalls, initiatives, referenda, and then CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, which in our report we actually spend quite a lot of time talking about whose pathologies we spend some time talking about. The problem, just to get to the bottom line of the report, is that direct democracy multiplies veto points, makes collective action much more difficult. So California's got a lot of big challenges. We have to deal with changing climate, environmental adaptations, and mitigations. We've got a housing crisis, any number of issues that have been studied by other parts of California 100, and you can't deal with any of them without thinking about governance. And the challenges to governance right now in the United States and in this state are enormous. So let's begin with the national level obstacles. The most obvious one is polarization. Congress can't agree on budgets, yearly budgets, most basic function, but there's a whole range of federal issues, immigration, dealing with pandemics, a lot of different things that have been blocked by the red-blue division that exists in Washington that is now filtering down to a local level. So many issues that had been decided by localities are now politicized by the larger polarization. Declining trust in institutions, this is something that's been going on for 50 years. Legacy media, a lot of deliberate trying to undermine trust in institutions. And then a broad phenomenon, which is the decline of local media. So something like $50 billion that used to go into advertising in local newspapers has now been gobbled up by these big platforms sitting here in different parts of Silicon Valley, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth. As a result, in this state, only 43 of 482 cities actually have a local newspaper. The total number of papers just in the last 15 years has gone from about 480 to 360, and so there's much less information out. So those are general issues. Specific to California, you have these direct democracy institutions. Recalls, initiatives, and referenda were put into the Constitution in the early decades of the 20th century. They're originally populist measures meant to get around a corrupt state legislature, but they've had a very paradoxical effect. They've got very low signature thresholds to get items, let's say to get an initiative going. Only 8% for recalls, 5% for initiatives, and as a result, these measures have skyrocketed. Recalls used to be less than 10 a year as late as 2008. Now they're up to about 100 per year. You remember the latest one with Governor Newsom, in which if he had gotten 49% of the vote in that recall, he could have been replaced by a conservative activist who never pulled more than about 25% popularity. Initiatives have gone up very sharply since the 2000s, and CEQA lawsuits, in 2020 there were 118,000 of them filed in the state. This leads to something that we label vetocracy, in which there's a spreading out of authority over so many institutions that it really is hard to force a single decision. That is supplemented by the extreme fragmentation. This is something that Bruce, I guess, I don't know whether you'll talk about this, Henry, in your giving of Bruce's part of the report, but there are 230 executive branch agencies in California, 58 counties, 481 incorporated cities, and 3,400 special districts, each of which has a certain share of responsibility for the state, but they lack a kind of higher coordinating function, and in particular, they're not forced to make trade-offs. Again, if Bruce were here, he would say, as he did in his book, Democracy More or Less, there's a big problem with the theory of direct democracy. It kind of assumes that all 40 million residents of California, every man, woman, child, and baby, are well informed, they have a lot of time and interest in public affairs, and it's simply not the case. They do not have, and in fact it's irrational for them to spend even the amount of time that's necessary to go through one of those books you get every election, just talking about the initiatives that are up for ballot, because it's the size of a small telephone book. I'm a political scientist, I'm very concerned with public affairs. I cannot get through one of these books because it's simply not a good use of my time, and the result is that decisions are actually recaptured by powerful organized interest groups. And this is, one of the conditions that leads to this general situation of vetocracy, where it's extremely easy to stop things and it's very difficult to achieve collective action. We have 4 scenarios. We have 2 basic axes. One of them, is direct versus representative democracy. Are Californians going to continue to use these direct democracy mechanisms, or do they want to return responsibility to the legislature, the governor, other elected officials? The other has to do with decreasing or increasing civic capacity. There's one really bad outcome of the 4 boxes that this matrix leads to, which is a deepening of vetocracy, where basically things are so paralyzed, they're so fragmented that the state simply cannot address any of the big problems, especially at the higher statewide levels. There's a couple of intermediate, less bad outcomes. So one we call California technocracy, in which there's a re-centralization of authority in the hands of basically technocrats, in Sacramento that are qualified, skilled, but there's much less participation overall. Another we call Burbclave, California. This comes from a Neil Stephenson science fiction novel, Snow Crash, in which there's so much fragmentation that every suburban subdivision has become a sovereign entity. So California is not quite there, but in that scenario, there is fragmentation continuing, but a lot of capacity within each of these subunits in the state, which at least gives you a better hold on some public policy issues, but does not really integrate decisions at a statewide level. The best outcome, of course, is some rollback of direct democracy combined with greater capacity. We do deal with a couple of policy issues. We have some specific ideas about how to reform CEQA. Not an easy thing to do. There have been literally hundreds of legislative attempts to sort of grab back some of CEQA's powers. Most of them have failed. We have some ideas about how you might do this. There are other ideas that have been put forward about how you deal with declining local media. A lot of it, for example, could be simple taxation of the big platforms to provide, to send back some of the revenues that they've been scooping up to local newspapers and TV stations that would actually cover local events, but we can discuss that more in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I think one of the themes that we're detecting today, like that California seems to be succeeding despite itself, but maybe that won't always be the case. I'm also thinking about this death by 118,000 cuts, Frank. That's something that I'll be thinking about in terms of, or even the kind of fragmentation of jurisdictions that you talked about, not only with local governments, but with all those special districts as well. Finally, we have Henry Brady, who's substituting in for Bruce Kane, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. And in addition to Bruce, we have Kate Gibson and others who contributed to this report, and Henry's one of the co-authors of the report. Henry.
Yeah, let me begin with my thanks to Bruce Kane, who's the primary author of this report, but also Kate Gibson, Kylie Gordon, Olivier Pop, and Ira Sway, who started with the project but tragically passed away halfway through it. She was, by the way, also one of my PhD students, so it was really a sad thing. What is federalism, and why do we conjoin it with foreign policy? Let me give an example. Colorado River water in Southern California. Colorado River Basin flows through 7 states, ends at the Gulf of Mexico in Mexico. To govern the allocation of this water, there's an international treaty between the United States and Mexico. There's a 7-state compact. In Southern California, there's the Southern California Metropolitan Water District, which includes 6 counties, parts of 6 counties, 13 cities, and 12 water districts, which are smaller water districts within the Metropolitan Water District. This is a lot of governance, and it's complicated to get anything done with that many actors. Furthermore, some of the actors, like the Southern California Metropolitan Water District, have one thing on their mind, and that is dealing with the water. And they're going to protect their rights to that water no matter what. And the net result is that there are big issues coming down the river because, in fact, the flow of the river is 15 million acre feet according to the International Compact, and that's allocated between the various states and the nation of Mexico, but there's not that much water anymore. And there's every reason to believe it's going to be reduced into the future. And so there's not enough water to go around, and somehow through this system, which has promises of, for example, Imperial County gets 3.1 million acre feet, a fifth of the total every year. That's going to lead to difficult governance problems. Why do we include foreign policy? Well, for the obvious reason. Mexico is part of that. Furthermore, increasingly, California is becoming involved with other countries as it professes some of its policy perspectives and tries to push them forward. So there's two major problems I think we face in this area. Within the state, we've got to find better ways to coordinate what we're doing. And in some areas, we've done pretty well. We have some good ways of delivering health care. Covered California has been a tremendous success. I think in the energy field, by and large, we've done pretty well. I think in the water area, we haven't done so well. The second thing we have to do as a state is establish our position in the federal system of the United States and put forth our agenda and make sure that we're not shortchanged on that agenda by forces in Washington, D.C. You might not think that's possible, but look at the last 4 years when Donald Trump was president. There were a lot of efforts to cut off California in various ways, to tax it more, to restrict it in terms of environmental controls, and to do other things. And there's every reason to believe that there's going to be people in Washington sometimes who are not going to be helpful to California, and California has to find a way to work its way through that federal system. Within the state of California, we have 58 counties, and Frank said 481 cities. My count is 482, but who knows? 1,011 school districts and thousands of special districts. So many that actually different sources give you different numbers. So it's not even clear that we have a good enumeration of all the special districts. That's like water districts, fire districts, and so forth. The state government and local governments spend approximately the same amount of money. At the local level, that money is split up about equally across the four types of local governments, which are counties, cities, school districts, and special districts. Notice, by the way, that means that special districts spend as much as school districts, as much as cities, as much as counties. The division of labor between the state and these various local governments is the following. The state tends to take on things that have very statewide importance. Now, that's not always true because there's historical accidents of what gets lodged where, but that's basically what the state does. So it deals with things like social welfare policies, which involve a lot of redistribution and couldn't be well handled in local areas. That's things like Medi-Cal, food stamps, and so forth. The state unemployment insurance would be another example. Higher education is another thing. Local governments tend to deal with things like water, police, education, waste facilities, and so forth. Things that basically have to do with individuals getting services that are best handled at the local area. Some things are split, corrections, there's jails and prisons, and transportation, there's local roads, and there's state highways. But that's the division of labor. And that works pretty well. The problem is that our problems are changing. It used to be that energy was produced by large public utilities, and those large public utilities could be regulated at the state level, and that worked sort of pretty well, times not so well, but nevertheless it could be done. Water policy is changing as well, with the diminution of the snowpack, the need to rethink how we're going to deliver water, how we're going to use water. Going back to the energy field, there's now local energy providers. In fact, I'm a local energy provider. I put energy back on the web through the solar panels on my roof. This means we have to rethink the governance in these areas. By and large, the report argues that we've done pretty well in energy policy. We've set goals for ourselves. We're trying to do a lot of innovation, and we've been pretty good at that. In water policy, we haven't done so well. There's a lot of entrenched interests. There's some very curious aspects of Western law that have an impact on water policies. And then there's these things like the Colorado River Pact. There's also things like the fact that a lot of the water is in the north of the state, but it's a lot of people in the south of the state, and that leads to difficulties in governance. So water policy is fragmented, and we've got to rethink it. But also, we've even got to rethink energy policy, because we've got to deal with things like local energy providers, and how are we going to regulate those? Okay, the second challenge facing California is its position in the federal system. We've got 2 senators. There's 2 senators for Wyoming and Montana, too. In fact, there's 4 for those 2 states, not to mention North Dakota and South Dakota. California has 62 times more people per senator, has 1/62 of the number of people per senator as does Wyoming. That is to say, we're underrepresented in the great gerrymander which created the Constitution. That means that often we don't get our way, and in fact, if you look at what's happening with the Senate, more and more we have an aggregation of people into large metro areas in this country. That means some states have a lot of population, other states don't have so much population, and the states with lots of population still get only 2 senators. And those tend to have distinctive concerns because they're urban areas. And the net result is underrepresentation for urban interests, actually, in America. It's also the case that California increasingly has an international presence. California needs to think about how it operates, both within the federal system and internationally. A possible model is Quebec. Quebec, within the Canadian Federation, decided early on that it was distinctive, partly because of the French language and its history. And it decided that it would, starting in the 1960s, have its own foreign policy. That didn't make Canada very happy, but they did do that, and they had people going abroad representing Quebec. It also decided that it had to interact with the other provinces in ways to make known Quebec's interests and concerns. Now, they took the step of talking about actually secession, of leaving the Confederation, Canadian Confederation. I don't think California could do that or should do that, and the Civil War sort of settled that as something you shouldn't do as part of the United States of America. But I think California could learn from Quebec. It could learn to define what it's about. It could learn to define what it wants from the federal government. To give some examples of where we've done this already is energy policy. Governor Brown and now Governor Newsom have worked very hard with other countries to push forward energy policies. Immigration is another area where we've got a distinctive policy. Gay marriage was another area where we had a distinctive policy. California is in fact starting to create institutions to do these things. One is Governor Newsom created the International Affairs and Trade Development Interagency Committee. There's also the City of Los Angeles, which has a deputy mayor in charge of foreign relations. So that's the future. What are the critical uncertainties? One is whether or not we try to deal with some of these coordination problems and revamp our governance system. Another thing is just what kinds of problems are we going to face? And one of the scenarios amongst our 4 scenarios that's very worrisome is that even with efforts to try to coordinate things, we fear that if there's really extreme challenges like climate change, that California is going to find it increasingly difficult to get anything done. And the only way it's going to be able to get anything done is through emergency measures. So we call that a state of permanent emergency. And that's the good scenario. Thanks.
Actually, so I'm going to stay where I am. One of the deputy mayor of LA with a foreign policy portfolio is one of our commissioners, Nina Hichigian, who initially was going to be here today, but she's busy planning the Summit of the Americas, which is coming up in Los Angeles in a few days. But we have 2 other commissioners here today who can, and the first of which can speak a little bit to California's foreign policy because she's a senior advisor, I believe that's the title, to the China-California Climate Initiative. And that's Louise Bedsworth, who will speak a little bit on the foreign policy side, but also to issues of governance and federalism based on some of her experiences. Louise.
Great. Thank you. I started with a few things and I kept scribbling more things, so I'll try to make this coherent. But I think everyone alluded to climate change, and I've spent my career working mostly on environment and climate policy in California, so I'll speak through that lens and try to hit, I think, on three elements. One is sort of California's role on a global stage, and then talk about some work that is happening within California, sort of at the state level and then even at a local level. I think that touch on issues of federalism and governance. And I would say that was captured perfectly when someone said the problems are changing, right? So climate change is changing everything around us. It's exacerbating a lot of issues we're already facing, so it's a stressor, and it's really foundationally also exacerbating our inequity as a state. So it is a massive challenge that touches every part of our society. So I think California really, going back to the Clean Air Act, has special authority that was given to it by the federal government to regulate certain sources of emissions on its own, separate from the federal government. I think that's been a very important power that the state has had and has used to develop a leadership position on climate change. And this has gone from starting with starting to understand the impacts of climate on California, but then establishing the first passenger vehicle standards for greenhouse gas emissions that ultimately have become the new CAFE standards for the federal government. That took some time, had some detours via George Bush, Donald Trump, and others along the way, but is a model for, I think, how California has used that power to really be a leader. And then alongside that has really taken a role in being an ambassador for taking that leadership position into the international stage. So you've seen California under a number of governors, but especially Governor Brown and Governor Newsom, enter into memorandums of understanding with foreign governments around working collaboratively on climate change issues, building large coalitions of subnational governments. So climate change is handled through the international body, where subnational governments don't have a real seat. But California has taken a role in coalescing those subnational governments, cities, states, provinces, from around the world to collectively bring their voice into those proceedings. So you've seen the establishment of the Under 2 Memorandum of Understanding, which I think right now is over 200 subnational governments who are all committed to deep greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. California also, which is very important right now, has an ongoing memorandum of understanding with China through the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. And just in April, the Newsom administration renewed that memorandum of understanding with the Chinese government. This is incredibly important because it provides a vehicle to work collaboratively on a number of issues addressing climate change. And so that work is getting underway. A work plan is being developed and will be proceeding hand in hand between the Ministry of Ecology and Environment and the state of California. In addition, California has a cap and trade system that is linked with Quebec, we just heard about, and has really been able to work in that way as well to jointly reduce emissions. There's a number of other things. California has memorandums of understanding with Mexico as well, not just around climate issues, but around a number of border issues, water being one. So I think those are all just really, really important places where California has taken a role on an international stage, really stemming from important authorities that it has. I think when you look at California as a state, you also see the multi-level governance challenge that climate change is presenting. I think one of the reports mentions over about half of our land in California is owned by the federal government. Those tend to be our national forests, our national parks, Bureau of Land Management lands. Those happen to also be a lot of places where we see fires and other things happening. And so when we look at how do we manage for these risks, we have to do it hand in glove, not just with our federal government, but with our local government partners. And just as an example, I wanted to highlight a project that's underway that actually started back in 2015 really, during the Obama administration up in Tuolumne County. And the Rim Fire, people might remember that one. For a little while, it was our largest wildfire. It's been surpassed several times in the last few years. But the Rim Fire burned 276,000 acres in federal forest land and in Tuolumne County. And we received a $70 million grant from the federal government to support a resilient recovery in that region. And so we got together a group to say, what would that look like? Around the table, we had CAL FIRE, the U.S. Forest Service, Tuolumne County, the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, which is a regional state agency, the Department of Housing and Community Development, the California Environmental Protection Agency, the governor's office, and community-based organizations, all coming together as what does that solution look like? It is investments in our natural ecosystems. It's investments in the economic and infrastructure that we need to be able to bounce back or bounce forward following an event. It was all of these pieces needing to come together to say, what does resilience look like? It's natural systems, it's built systems, and it's our people and our economy. And so what does that take? That's not the natural way government operates, but it's how communities thrive and grow. So that's a huge challenge. And that was, it is being implemented, and I could talk forever about it, it's one of my favorite projects, but it's a really hard thing to do. And so how do we make that easier? So that'll be my final point, which is just how does the state of California try to make it easier to do these things? And I'll point to one example that we have, which is the California Strategic Growth Council. This was established in 2008 to bring together all the state agencies that touch on sustainable community development, transportation, health, housing, food and agriculture, environmental protection, natural resources, health and human services, 3 public members, and the governor's office. And so that organization is there to bring those agencies together to say, how do we tackle these problems? And what they've done is they have designed new kinds of programs that do investments in housing and transportation jointly, designed to work in our most urban communities through to rural and tribal communities. And what does that look like? And so that is, I think, a really important innovation. We can't have every dollar go through the Strategic Growth Council, but I think we have to start looking at how do we have models like that really start permeating and being replicated throughout government. So with that, I will end there.
Thank you so much, Louise. And Louise used to be the director of the Strategic Growth Council, which two things that you mentioned, if we have time, would love to dig deeper into. One is this notion of functional federalism. It's an idea in California 100 we're playing around with, where jurisdictions exist for good reason, but when problems present themselves, like the fire example that you talked about, it's inspiring to know that from time to time you can do this. But how do we make that more regular? Interestingly, the example you gave was another problem, which is interagency coordination at the same level of government. But how do we move from having these promising examples for it to be more routine and practice in terms of how we govern and solve problems in California? Finally, we have Jonathan Mehta Stein, another one of our commissioners. He's the executive director of California Common Cause, who will say a bit more about the governance challenges facing California.
Yeah, thanks, Karthick. And thank you to all of the presenters today for what they've been able to contribute. We've heard a ton about governance structures, democratic institutions. I want to add a perspective to today's conversation, which is the perspective of people interacting with their government or choosing not to participate in their government. As far as I think I can tell, and probably any of us can tell, people's perceptions of their government are terrible at the current moment, right? Everyone sees our government at the federal level in particular, or maybe even at the state or local level, with cynicism, distrust, a certain amount of distaste. And that's reflected in California in our participation rates. People assume that voting in California is pretty seamless, it's easy, and as a result, we presumably have high participation. The reality is that our voter turnout basically tracks the national average. Sometimes it's a little lower. Sometimes, maybe if we're lucky, it's a little bit higher. It's never consistently higher than the national average. And we have deep participation disparities on the basis of race and the basis of age. With Latino and Asian American voters in particular left way behind within our electorate, with black voters left behind as well, and young voters participating at a fraction of the rate of the rest of the electorate. And this isn't because of barriers. This isn't because of election law choices that we're making. California in the last decade has passed same-day voter registration, automatic voter registration, pre-registration of 15 and 16-year-olds, universal access to vote by mail, postage paid vote by mail. It's not that people can't access their ballot. It's that people don't see democracy as worth participating in. And I think in order to solve that problem, we have to look more holistically at the problems that we're facing. So I think we have to look at the decline in trust in expertise and experts and data in science and in institutions, which is intimately tied to polarization, as Frank mentioned earlier. The way in which the culture war has seemed to gobble up the entire national discourse on any topic, give any topic, no matter how easy it was to find consensus on that topic in the past, give it one run through the news cycle, and it will be fodder for the culture war, and we will find a way to divide ourselves as a country on that topic. I think we need to look at information systems. Frank in the report goes into great detail on this. We've lost a quarter of our newsrooms. We've lost half of our journalists in the last 10 years. Ethnic media outlets and local media outlets are dying by the week in California. And what that means is we're losing trusted, locally rooted, nonpartisan, independent sources of news about your community. And instead, you get social media misinformation and disinformation that rushes to fill the void, or Fox News, or whatever the case may be. And so instances in which you saw your local government working to rebuild a park or improve a school that were reported on in your local newspaper are gone. Even if your local government is still doing that work, you're never hearing about it. And instead, all you hear about is deadlock in Congress or in our federal government, or Tucker Carlson attacking whomever, BTS for going to the White House, or whatever the case may be. This nonsense fodder for the culture wars. Another, I think, is money in politics, which has kind of become unfashionable in the democracy space to talk about. And I actually think it's important to discuss, not so much because of the possibility of sort of everyday corruption where somebody's giving a massive campaign contribution in order to get a waste contract, though that does happen and it does decrease trust in our local government, but because less than 1% of Americans ever donate to a politician. And if you are in the other 99%, you are left with a perception that your elections are decided before you ever go to the ballot. And that there is a class of people that are totally non-representative of the public at large who have the ear of our politicians, and as a result, act as a silent guiding hand of our democratic institutions. And if that's the case, then why would you participate? And there's solutions on the media and democracy piece. There's solutions on the money and politics piece that we don't have time to get into. Just a couple last things that I want to talk about very, very quickly. One is that we need to be addressing this problem in California starting as early as possible. We need media literacy. We need civics education. We need to be building a culture of deep civic engagement starting in our schools at the earliest ages. And sort of tangential to everything else I've discussed, it's because of the climate change challenges that we face, we need to build election resilience. We are going to hold all of our elections during wildfires, pandemics, and other global warming challenges. My fiance is the executive director of a civil rights organization. Half of her staff got COVID organizing voters for their recent state primary. This is in another state. That's just reality for California's elections going forward. And if we are struck by some sort of massive natural disaster that impacts our ability to count votes effectively, I fear that our democracy is just one blow away from some sort of fatal collapse. And so we need to be mindful of all of that while we're tackling all these larger issues as well. Thanks.
So, folks, California 100 is about aspirational futures, even though, of course, we have to take into account these doom and gloom scenarios as well. We have about 5 minutes. I'm just going to tee up two things. One, I'm going to ask Jonathan and Frank here into this question about governance and kind of participatory governance as opposed to direct democracy. It seems like if part of governance is just doing a job well and having these public agencies deliver their services and regulating the harms in society well, who cares if people participate, right? But surely, I mean, so that you can have governance in a non-democratic system. What should we be thinking about, Frank? And maybe Jonathan, Frank, just quickly, you can jump in, and then we can go to fiscal reform right after that. But is there something that we need to think more deeply about in terms of governance in a democratic context?
Well, so I actually teach a course about democratic governance, and we address this issue of participation, at some length. In modern government, if you don't have participation, you're going to make huge mistakes. If you don't get stakeholder input at a very early point in determining any public policy, and you're just sitting as a technocrat in an office somewhere cut off from that, you're just going to, history is full of big disasters that have resulted from this. Like Putin's war in Ukraine is one of them, But at a much smaller scale, you have to have participation, but managing that participation is a very, very complicated thing. And as I was saying, it helps to have as much broad participation early on, but as you move, for example, to the deliberation stage, you actually need a little bit of privacy, because if people are going to actually say honestly what they think about things, they can't have the whole world listening in, on, experimental positions that they take, or they're not going to take risks, that sort of thing. And so I think that you have to kind of get the right degree of participation at the correct moments, and not overpromise. And I think, unfortunately, we still don't know how to do that properly, to keep it at the right stages, but then actually be able to come together for a collective decision at some point.
Well, to be continued on some of this, folks, Frank, you and I were talking earlier, you do a lot of work with other countries. Maybe there's some room for some consulting work in California to improve our governance systems in addition to our government systems. Patrick, just want to have you weigh in a bit about volatility is this kind of a theme, right? I mean, our current system of revenues, certainly at the state level, very volatile. There have been people talking about ways of trying to reform, including, expanding the sales tax to include services, et cetera, ways to stabilize this, but it never seems to happen. How can we convince Californians that it's time to have a more stable set of revenues?
So two things. I mean, one, it would be nice if the revenue projections, what we'd expect to get was more predictable and stable, because that just makes planning easier and makes people whose job it is that have to do that easier and more desirable. And at the same time, I would say that we've taken some steps. So the reason we have the volatility is we lean so heavily on the income tax, and in particular on the highest income folks, and those folks specifically on non-wage income. Capital gains it creates a lot of the spikes and lumps. And so with that, when the market's going well and the economy's going well, it just goes through the roof. And then you've got this big chunk of money. And depending on the choices you make, and this is where one of the ways you can address it is, if you don't just invest and say hire a bunch of people who you have to pay year after year, you can kind of smooth out some of that volatility. You can make some choices around that. And the state has done that. And it started with Governor Brown. It's continued with Governor Newsom in terms of putting aside money for reserves. We've got a much more, a better reserve policy than we had prior to the Great Recession. That's good. It's not as big as it should be, I would feel, but there's other things we could do. And then what you choose to spend on it. But if you really want to take on those big structural pieces, you're going to have those very uncomfortable conversations. And there was a time under Governor Schwarzenegger where there was this grand bargain kind of put out there with a Blue Ribbon Commission of how we could address that, and a big broad-based consumption tax. And as you can see, we don't have that.
Yeah. 1 minute for the remaining speakers. Just kind of what makes you, cautiously optimistic or hopeful, for California's long-term future. So we'll start with Louise and we'll end with Henry.
I think it's interesting, and I'm thinking about this because it maybe stands a little bit in contrast, maybe not in contrast, but a different take on the participation, which is, as Karthick mentioned, I was at the Strategic Growth Council for a number of years, and I got to go around the state and see projects happening in communities all over the state. And I would say that's where I see the most inspiration coming from, is a lot of the community-driven solutions that we're seeing coming out, and the ways that we are taking steps to enable more community voice in setting visions and priorities. And I think we're going to have to figure out how we marry those two things, this bottom-up and more top-down approach. But when I see the work that is happening on the ground, I definitely feel more hopeful.
Yeah, I think that on our democracy, in the democracy agenda, I think increasingly as people see our federal government as incapable of passing anything or fixing anything, there's lots of local innovation and solutions that are bubbling up, which are really exciting. In the city of Oakland right now, we're working to pass on November's ballot something called Democracy Dollars, which were piloted in Seattle. It's the idea that you send every eligible resident 4 $25 vouchers that they can donate to politicians, candidates, campaigns. It turns every household into a donor household. And so if you are a candidate and you're running for office, ordinarily you're just going to target donating households and regular voting households. Now all of a sudden you have a reason to go knock on every single door within the city of Oakland, including in neighborhoods that are traditionally ignored, families that are never voting. And the results out of Seattle are dramatic increases in the number of small donors, dramatic increases in the diversity of donors, dramatic increases in the diversity of candidates, and remarkably, increases in voter turnout among first-time voters and low-propensity voters because people are coming and pulling them into the city's democracy for the first time. That's a program that exists in one city in America. And Oakland, we hope, will be number 2. And I think it's just going to be local solutions and local innovation that unearth solutions that hopefully then bubble up.
Henry.
Yeah, quickly, Democracy Dollars is a great idea, and I hope that gets passed. Number 2, we have had successes in California. We've done very well with energy policy, I think, and led the nation, led the world. I think Covered California is another example where we took Obamacare, we early on made innovations, we decided to negotiate contractors with suppliers ourselves, and we ended up with a system that really gave medical care to large numbers of people, and that also did it at relatively low costs. So there are things that California has done. The higher education system is another magnificent accomplishment of the state of California. Nobody has done what California has done in that area. Our job right now is to maintain that. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. First of all, just a hand to all of our speakers, please. And we hope you can join us for this special half-day conference that we have with CEPR, where now we're going to take a deeper dive into the future of fiscal reform with 3 key topics. I'm pleased to welcome back Mark Duggan, who's the director of CEPR. We're going to take a short break while we change microphones and swap places with our speakers. Thank you, everyone.